All right, so I'm going to start this morning. I'm going to finish up chapter 9 and go on to chapter 10. Quick warning, chapter 10 is about a lot about death and disease, so it might be painful for some people, so I want to warn you ahead of time. So one thing I have left to talk about for chapter 9. I used to work at a PBS station in California that was channel 9, so that always hits in my head. All right, so the real legacy, the exemplary legacy that we know about the medieval period is the medieval cathedral. A cathedral is more than just a church, and it's more than just a large church. Cathedrals are often the seats of bishops, cardinals, churchmen who basically are the administrators for a particular region, not just their church. And so consequently, the medieval cathedrals are larger, they are spectacular, and they often hold a special seat or throne for the local bishop. And he presides over Mass quite frequently in his cathedral, or at least that's the idea. But these cathedrals were not necessarily the purview of the church, because you see, the towns wanted to come together and actually create something special in their own cathedrals. The towns would be known by their cathedrals, actually. These cathedrals are very much for performance of the liturgy, as well as merely a place to go to Mass. That it has theatrical elements of music and drama and preaching and beautiful costumes, and of course, magnificent settings and lighting. I mean, it truly is a theater. I do not mean that in a negative sense. I mean that is the elements that we look for in theater. That is the elements that the medieval people looked for in their cathedrals. They are going to be a challenge for each town to build their cathedral bigger and better and more beautiful than the next town. And these larger and more beautiful cathedrals are going to reflect the growing power of the church and the wealth of the cities. So it was a prestige project, a project to show off. There's going to be two different styles of cathedrals, basically. There's going to be differences on each, but the two basic styles that we identify are the Romanesque and the Gothic. The Romanesque, as you can probably tell by the name, is basically based on Roman architecture, and I mean ancient Roman architecture. They started around in the 10th century, and they are basically identified by their rounded arch, their massive stone walls, and their giant supporting columns. Everything in this church is big, however, it's not that tall. In order to hold up the roofs, the walls of the church were made wider and wider and wider so that they could get up to a certain height. And the columns holding the roof up, those two were going to get wider and wider. And the wide walls meant very small windows. So the insides tended to have to be lit by artificial lighting, which of course in the Middle Ages meant candlelight. They also painted the insides of these Romanesque cathedrals very bright colors and put a lot of paintings on the wall, pardon me, fresco paintings, in order to make it seem more interesting. They are not huge, as I said, but they're stable and massive and a feeling of permanence about them. They're also very warm inside, not temperature wise, but you don't get a feeling of alienation in them, that they are a refuge that people can go to. So these cathedrals reflected what the people who built them wanted in their cathedrals. They wanted a place that was stable, that was permanent, and that was a place of refuge. So here is a typical Romanesque cathedral. You will see there are very few windows where we might expect windows along the sides. There's just one central one that's fitted inside one of these beautiful rounded arches. And of course, here's the repetition of the rounded arch, very reminiscent of the Roman aqueducts. And they're made out of a very light colored sandstone. The discoloration is because of air pollution that will happen thanks to generations of smoke from cooking fires and heating fires. And then after the 18th century, we will see industrial smoke from coal fires. And this smoke will stain the rocks, not quite permanently. Many of these buildings have been restored, have been cleaned up, but a lot of the damage had been done because with the coal smoke, you get acid rain, and that will tend to dissolve the rock. So it's been a fight to save these buildings. Even though they look like massive and they seem to be permanent, they really are in need of tender loving care very frequently. So that's Romanesque. The second is, of course, Gothic. It's going to appear in Northern Europe, away from Rome, in the 12th and 13th century. These Gothic cathedrals were meant to be the exact opposite of the Romanesque cathedrals. They were challenged to make different types of arches, different types of columns, and different types of walls. However, to build in the way that they did means that they had to improvise, they had to work with trial and error, they had to come up with a whole bunch of unique answers in order to keep the walls from falling down. They will be identified by their pointed arches, arches that are not rounded, but in fact come to a point. Now, those kind of arches have certain challenges to them, especially the pressure points, that there will be a specific point at which they will be the weakest and want to collapse. So these arches are going to have to be reinforced in a special way. These groined and ribbed vaults, they're going to be the same as the barrel vaults that the Romans had built and the Romanesque churches were based on. However, these will have a point to the top as they move down. And of course, the flying buttresses. These are the most unique aspects of these Gothic cathedrals because they are strictly supportive. They are part of the superstructure of the building. It is what keeps these cathedrals from collapsing under the weight of their roof. But at the same time, the engineers of the medieval period turned them into works of art. And they're spectacular to behold. Once you realize what they're doing, you see the genius involved. The whole point of Gothic cathedrals is to make them higher, lighter, and loftier. They are built with large columns, but thin walls. the construction techniques will allow for very thin walls. If you've got a thin wall, you can put in windows. And the windows will be one of the great focus of these medieval cathedrals. They will use the light in a most amazing way. So we today think of Gothic as, oh, so depressed, and people with black clothes and dark eye makeup and that sort of thing. It's the exact opposite. It was meant to be tall and beautiful and colorful and to amaze the public. They're known for exterior ornamentation, large amounts of statues everywhere, and of course, stained glass windows. These medieval cathedrals housed within them all of the art and cultural knowledge of the medieval people. It's like an encyclopedia of understanding who these medieval people are. So this is a Gothic cathedral, very different than the Romanesque. It's not short and stout. This is, I think this is Notre Dame de Paris, Notre Dame in Paris. We're not even down on the ground floor. We're starting the picture at about 30 feet high and going up and up and up. And these vertical lines, these very strict vertical lines, force your eyes up. You can't help but force your eyes up. They also make the building look taller, but you can see every niche filled with artwork. Every inch, there's some sort of a decoration. These buildings kept stonemasons and stone cutters and artisans busy for many, many years. Some cathedrals took centuries to build. Others, through experimentation, are going to have to develop ways to build because some of them will fall down. This is the floor plan. We're looking at the floor of Amiens Cathedral in France. It's as if we're looking straight down at it. And all of these black shapes here, those are the columns. That's the footprint of the columns. And in between are the walls. So you can see there's not much wall. It's not thick at all. All the weight is borne by these columns. And each run of these columns are the same. It might look complex, but actually once you've got this section here designed, then it's just repeated over and over. Or it might be turned on its side and repeated, or spun out around a central core. And so these are buildings that were designed and were laid out and were built with masonry string, which is string, that twine that will not stretch, with right angles, and with a knowledge of geometry. A lot of these buildings have very complex geometry involved in them. As you can see, you've got two groin vaults here meeting, and then they create their own bits of geometry, understanding that if you put a line, start it in the center and move it out, you get a circle or a partial circle. So these contain the builders and engineers' knowledge of not just design, but engineering. Amiens Cathedral will be built once, and then the roof will collapse, sadly killing some parishioners. And so they're going to have to rebuild it, but they're going to have to create new structures in order to support it. So this is if you're standing in the front door and looking down the central nave, and you see this is one very large, very tall opening of the structure. This is all open area. And this is an outer wall, but it's up on top of this roof with another outer wall. So you can see there is a step process here. This gap here is filled with two groin vaults. This is a hallway and this is a hallway. However, right here, we see what is the most important part of this superstructure. Those are the flying buttresses. The weakest point of this arch is right here. And so the idea is to take weight here and force it down and then down, and take a little bit more of this weight and force it down, so that actually this little joint doesn't have to support as much weight as it would if there was none of this superstructure. The roof is generally wood. There will be an under roof that is made out of tile or made out of stone, very light stone. But there's a second roof that goes on top, and that's usually got lead roofing tiles or ceramic roofing tiles. So you see, you have the big columns, you have these marvelous columns, but at the same time, you have lots of open area. These areas, the flying buttress is actually open outside. That's why they call it a flying buttress, because you can see it from the exterior, but it is carved in such a way that it looks like a natural part of the building. And you can see the flying buttress actually makes half of a groin arch, one of these pointed arch. So it's doing a considerable amount of work, but it's a brilliant piece of engineering, and to make it look like it's supposed to be there rather than just a prop to hold these buildings up. But the effect on the inside is to basically forces the parishioner, the person who comes into the building, to look up, to see these lines that are unbroken vertical lines going straight up. It's why women rarely wear stripes going across. They wear stripes going up and down because it makes it look thinner and taller. Oh, am I revealing too much? Anyway, so you have these magnificent lines, but you also have the availability to put in the windows. And these are stained glass windows. And these cathedrals are arranged in such a way that one of the sides will be entirely to the south. And so sunrise will be at one end, the sun travels across the building during the day, and then the sunset is at the front end of the building. I think it's usually set up that way. But that means that sunlight, bright sunlight, is coming through these windows. The windows on the other side, sometimes they're matching, sometimes they're different, sometimes they're plain white just to allow in the light, but you get these incredible splashes of color moving across the walls, or if the sun is high enough, moving across the floors. And it's really spectacular. It's a light show. And these stained glass windows have, sometimes they're geometric patterns, but oftentimes there's stories involved in them. So as one art critic called them, these are sermons in stone. They are telling the story of the New Testament and sometimes the Old Testament inside these very elaborate, ornate buildings. But these things weren't built by slaves. These buildings were built by master craftsmen, people who knew exactly what they were doing, people who knew how to carve stones and how to make them perfectly at 90-degree angles so that there wouldn't be any tipping. One stone out of place is going to magnify the tipping process. So these things had to be carved in a perfect way with specialized tools. They had to be moved up on top. That looks kind of like the hard way to do it. A much easier way is to use an elevator or a crane. The cranes of the time were a little bit different than what we think. Yes, that is a person in a hamster wheel. That is a tread crane, or a treadmill crane, as it's also called, and it has a human inside doing the motive force. Why not bring an animal in? Because animals do not follow directions efficiently and effectively. They won't listen to you. They get spooked if you have to take them very high. These cranes are up on top of the building. In fact, in the attics of certain cathedrals, these cranes are still there for you to see. That's why we know so much about them. But a human can work quickly, but also do it effectively, make very small marginal changes if need be, and very quickly turn around and lower it. So, there was no real gearing involved. You just walked one way to lift it up, turned around and walked the other way to take it down. However, getting things like the mortar that went between the stones, that was a difficult job. I would have hated this job too. It was a lot of work and they needed a lot of stones. Lest you think this guy, don't feel sorry for him. If you note, he's the only one eating in the picture. Keep that guy fed so that he doesn't leave and you're stuck without your crane. Excuse me. And of course, in this image, it is quite fanciful and you do have the supervisors looking in. Actually, this is an illustration from the Crusaders' Bible, the Majewski Bible, that's in the Morgan Library. And it is a illustration of the Old Testament story of the Tower of Babel. But you see the medieval building techniques. They were not, they didn't think about, hey, we need to be accurate. We need to find out how the people of ancient Sumeria built their buildings. No, they used artistically the techniques of the people of their time would use. And so the effects are amazing. But as I say, these were not faceless hordes or slaves building it. These are master craftsmen working at the very height of their art, creating something that they felt would be permanent. This is the St. Lawrence Cathedral in Nuremberg, Germany. It was built, I think, in the 15th century, 14th century, very much in the Gothic style, completely built out of stone. It was very badly bombed in World War II. And so they had to bring in a whole group of stonemasons to rebuild it using some of the same techniques. I was fortunate enough to interview a man who was one of the stonecutters. He was an apprentice stonecutter and learned all of these techniques on how to rebuild and how to make flying buttresses and how to make these incredible stone windows, especially the big round rose window. So he was one of the people who did the rebuilding on here. Thankfully, he moved to the United States after he was finished with this job and got a job working on the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., which is a Gothic cathedral. That was started in the 19th century. And there's still, parts of it they're still working on. But he was a major stonecutter on the National Cathedral and brought his expertise after having rebuilt the St. Lawrence Church in Nuremberg, brought his knowledge of this technique to America, and he was the one that made the flying buttresses of the National Cathedral work. They would have fallen in had he not been there. But this is a specialized part of the cathedral known as a tabernacle. It is a small shrine. It held a relic at one point, but this is all stone, about 70 feet tall. And you can't imagine it's stone. It's so light, it's so airy, it's like lace almost. And it's extraordinarily heavy, and it's supported by several legs and by figurines that were carved to hold it up. Now, and of course, as we're talking about a cathedral being a sermon in stone, here is a tribute to the stone cutters. We know who this man is. His name is Adam Kraft. We know from the records of building the cathedral. And he was honored by having his portrait essentially carved. And he's this figure right here. He's a little bit smaller than life size, but look at that tremendous amount of pride in his face, not to mention the righteous beard. That's a master craftsman. That's someone who was building something that he thought was going to be permanent. Thankfully, with a little bit of help, it has remained, and it has brought forward lessons for the people of our time as well, so that we can see this amazing handiwork. So do you have any questions for me before I continue on? Okay, let me get out of that. Just want to know if you do have any questions. Go ahead and ask. If you don't want to turn on the microphone, you're welcome to type it into place. But now I need to All right, so chapter 10, as I had warned at the beginning of the class, chapter 10 is rather disturbing, especially for people of right now, of today, because I'm going to be talking a lot about disease and death. So just want to warn you, it's not a pleasant lecture, but it is one of the most formative moments in the history of the West, and it will affect everyone throughout Europe and Asia. But, whoops, sorry, we get to talk about a whole new set of people who will be here and making a large difference in the world. And those are the Mongols. The Mongol Empire is going to arrive with a big splash, change much, and then be basically ruined by a microbe. The Mongols, very few people had even known about them. They were nomadic people in the Central Asian steppes. They were herders, they had yaks, they lived in yurts. They were highly mobile. They grass is sparse, so they had to move their livestock around quite a bit. So they were used to being on the road. They were excellent horsemen. And so they were very flexible. They were very mobile. They could go anywhere. They could adapt to almost every climate. They were very tough too. And so they made for a rather impressive military force. They could ride horses and shoot arrows almost 180 degrees from the direction the horse was moving. So they were, they could be riding away from you and still shoot and hit their target rather effectively. So they were quite frightening to fight because they were lightly armored. They were extremely quick. And sometimes speed is one of the great weapons at your disposal. One of their leaders, Temujin, who was the leader of a single tribe, decided to unite the Mongols under his rule and create a military force with the idea of spreading out and creating a real empire, which he does so quite successfully. However, this empire is going to take a couple of generations to fully build. Temujin, or Genghis Khan, is going to start it. His grandson Kublai Khan will finally put the finishing touches on by conquering China. So this military force is going to come out from the middle of the Asian steppes, from Mongolia, and spread to China and spread almost all the way to Europe. Come up against the Byzantine Empire, take over a very large part of the Abbasid Empire. They will leave India alone. I'm not sure why, but they will be able to do some pretty amazing things like conquer Russia in the winter. Napoleon tried to do it and he failed. Adolf Hitler tried to do it and he failed. The Mongols found that with their light little ponies, they could go across the landscape much more easily in winter because it was frozen. The cold didn't bother them. So they were very successful. But this is a really unique sort of empire, the way it was set up, because it was set up to encourage trade. And so they will build a highway called the Silk Road. Well, they'll improve on parts of it. Some of it was already there, but it will go from almost the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Mediterranean. And on this road, they will build in important areas, cities like Tashkent, Samarkand, and Bakhura. These cities that were basically stop areas, places where merchants could stop and rest and get more food, get more water, find out the conditions going ahead, and they facilitated trade. That was their big idea. Think of it as ancient Wawas. Anyway, the Mongols are going to take, as I said, southern Russia, and they're going to take Kiev as well. So they're going to move all over the place and be very difficult to stop. By the way, one of the Kazakhstan, I believe, is the country that they call themselves now. They now have a giant sculpture of Genghis Khan, and they have named their airport after him, the Genghis Khan International Airport. That's wild. Anyway, I wonder what Genghis Khan would have thought about it. So this is how far all the areas that are not this tan color, everything that's colored is the size of the Mongol Empire by 1294. That's how big it's going to be. The Mongols are also going to be the exception in that at the death of Genghis Khan, they're going to have to break up the empire into the sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan, and they'll still continue to make it work. They'll still continue to have a well-running empire. The Chagatai Khan was where the Mongols started. They will head east And the Khanate of the Great Khan, Kublai Khan, will stretch throughout the area we now know as Mongolia and Siberia, Korea, uh, China, Tibet. They will try to make it, they will build boats and try to make it to Japan, but they will be sunk by a typhoon and decide not to go. So they will stop on mainland China, but mainland China is sufficient. The Khanate of the Golden Horde, or the Kipchak Khanate, that would be run by Batu Khan, Batu Khan, and he will be the Khan of this very large area that goes into Russia along the Black and Caspian and Aral Sea and facilitate trade there. They're called the Golden Horde. Horde is kind of an ugly name. The Russians, in rewriting the history of their time here, like to identify the Mongols as being a horde, as being less than human. In reality, they're trying to do that to cover up the fact that these Russian principalities and Kiev and other parts of Russia, they were under the control of Batu Khan and had to pay tribute every year, or Batu Khan would come and do damage to their city. So they were really vassals to the Golden Horde. They called it the Golden Horde because of the court of Batu Khan sewed gold threads into their gorgeous kaftans, into their robes, and also into their tents, so that their tents gleamed in gold in the sunlight. So they were called the Golden Horde. One of the most fought over areas that the Khan's, Genghis Khan and his descendants will take is the Ilkhanate, which is essentially a good chunk of the Middle East. We're talking about Iran and Iraq, and parts of areas that we know as Afghanistan, etc., and Persia. This will be an area that's very heavily contested by the Khanate, and there will be quite a bit of violence involved in taking it and holding it. And because there's so much violence, it's going to weaken many of the structures here, and it's going to allow for other groups to come in, but I'll talk about those other groups in the next chapter. So these are the four main regions that the empire has to break up into, but they still run it successfully for 100 years. That 100 years, we call it the Pax Mongolica. Like the Pax Romana, this is the Pax Mongolica, or the time of the peace of the Mongols. Their territory covered 1/5 of the Earth's surface, that part of the surface that is covered with land. It's a mind-bogglingly big empire. And even though there wasn't an absolute ruler, the different khans would create a flexible administration that would basically police the area, much like the Roman and Hellenistic models. They were religiously tolerant. Most of the Mongols were animists. They believed in animal spirits. They weren't monotheists at all, and most were not Muslim, and they were tolerant of other people's religion. They allowed those areas that they conquered, they allowed them to keep some of their leadership as long as they promised to give them a tribute, and they allowed them to keep their religion. They didn't ask them to convert in any way. What the Mongols wanted was facilitating that trade, getting goods moving east and goods moving west. So merchants and artists are having an absolute field day moving back and forth. However, it's still going to be a system that depended parts of it on slavery, um, and forced relocation. They will force people to move to their new cities, uh, and Samarkand and Tashkent. Uh, so it's not all extremely benevolent. It was, a lot of it was taken by force. It had to be done through warfare, and the conquest was often very bloody. Baghdad suffered a huge amount of damage when the Mongols moved in. So, what is going to disintegrate the Mongol rule? Number one, size. It is merely, even if you've broken it up, it is such a huge area to police, is very difficult. They are going to run into competition with the various trading entities in Europe, because you've got the Genoese sailors, the Venetian sailors, you've still got the Byzantine Empire running around wanting its cut, you've got the Arab traders throughout Saudi Arabia. Um, there's a lot of people to have to deal with. And of course, as I said, a microbe that's going to bring it all crashing down. So conditions are going to make it very difficult to sustain this network. Um, First, the middle of the Silk Road is where we see the bubonic plague show up. That's one problem with it. The availability of movement back and forth meant that plague very easily moved west, and it very easily moved east. In fact, the Chinese will overthrow the last Mongol rulers of China in 1368 and completely shut down the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road was crucial to the Europeans because they wanted the goods from China. They wanted the silk, they wanted the spices, they wanted all the things that they could get from China. The Chinese wanted very little from the West. Uh, they weren't interested in the goods the West was producing because they could produce far better goods. This is really one of the great heights of Chinese culture. They did not see and have any interest in what the Europeans were doing. All they wanted was money. And so the currency moved to China. And those of you who study economics will say, but wait a minute, if all the trade goes in one direction, if all the goods come one way and all the money goes the other way, isn't that going to lead to major imbalances? Oh, yeah, it's going to lead to huge imbalances. One would think that those imbalances are going to right themselves when the demand in Europe dries up and the borders to China closes, but they don't. Um, there's still a desire in the West to get these fantastic goods from China, and they're going to find a way to do it. Now, that desire to find a way to get to China to get these goods is going to spur the age of discovery. It's going to spur a huge number of innovations that are going to change the face of what Europe is like, how they reach out to other people. So definitely that desire to reestablish the connection between East and West, even though the Silk Road is entirely broken down, that's going to fuel an amazing amount of innovation in Europe that I'll be talking about. Also, the Silk Road, the Pax Mongolica, that is the moment that we read about in the writings of Marco Polo. Marco Polo is more than just a swimming pool game. Marco Polo was a real person who was a young man who traveled with his uncle, who was a merchant, from the Italian peninsula all the way to China. And he spent 20 years in China writing, and he wrote a memoir of his travels. There will also be memoirs written by travelers from Africa. There will also be memoirs written by Muslim travelers from North Africa. So when we look at it from a Western viewpoint, we think that Marco Polo was like the only guy to go to China. Actually, there were quite a few people that traveled. It's just that you didn't hop on a plane and get there and spend 2 weeks and then hop back on the plane and come back. You left for decades sometimes. The trip itself took quite a few months, if not a year, just to make it. So definitely a fascinating look at these mixings of cultures. If you want to find out more about that, look up the Silk Road. Now, I will say that currently China and Russia and some of the other countries in Europe and Asia are looking to recreate the Silk Road. They're looking to make a superhighway that goes from China to Turkey, facilitating trade, turning it back into the Silk Road. Even though there's not a lot of silk to be trading, there's a lot of other things that are highly desirable. China needs fuel. China has very little of its own stocks of oil and other fuel. They have to buy it from elsewhere. China, strangely enough, even though we think of it as this country that has these marvelous things like spices and silk and tea, those are insect and plant growths. So those are a more agricultural plant, a product that have to be worked with a high amount of labor. But as far as mineral wealth, China has very little. So the Silk Road, the new Silk Road, is intended to create trading across Asia and Europe so that China can get better access to minerals, of which many very rare minerals like lithium are available only in Afghanistan, or mainly in Afghanistan. So the Silk Road is intended to allow China to bring in mineral wealth like oil, like other rare minerals, and at the same time distribute the goods that its very large labor force allows for manufacture. So be watching this new Silk Road. The building of it is going to be fascinating, and the ramifications equally as fascinating, just like what happened in Europe in the early 14th century. Yes, sir. Remy, did you have a question? Okay. All right. So, as I explained, the currency of Europe was going to China on the Silk Road to buy luxury goods during the 13th and the early part of the 14th century. Europe needed more money. That money was going to China and never coming back. There was no circulation. It was merely a one-way ticket. And so Europe needs gold. Where is it going to go? Well, there's not a lot of gold in Europe. They haven't found at this point. Oh, okay. All right. They haven't found the silver mines that they're going to find. There's some extensive silver mines in Bohemia, but they won't find those until the middle of the 14th century. And so there are silver and gold shortages throughout Europe. Where are they going to find more of that? Well, they're going to go exactly where the ancient Egyptians went for gold, exactly where the ancient Romans went for gold, et cetera, et cetera. And that's Africa. Because there are sections of Africa, areas we used to call Nubia, that were absolutely wealthy with gold. And the West is looking at it with very avaricious eyes. They are greedy. They want some of that gold. And they want to open up trade and colonial empires on Africa in order to facilitate more trade. So this trade between Europe and Africa is not new, but it's going to be ramped up during this time, this real need for gold. So much so that sailors from Genoese and Catalan will be trading woolen cloth for gold in Tunisia. I'm not sure how well that works. Because when one thinks of woolen cloth, one thinks of sweaters in Tunisia, a desert. Well, we'll see. Anyway, so this silver shortage and this cash flow problem is going to affect Europe in how it's going to manage its economy. Remember, there are no economists. There's no stock exchanges yet. It's the free hand of the market, essentially, except it isn't, because you've got various kings and kingdoms coming in and affecting the flow of money. And you've got the church is affecting the flow of money as well with certain laws it had. And if you recall, the Roman Catholic Church for a long time had laws against Christians loaning Christians money with interest. Otherwise, there's no incentive to loan money. Therefore, people needed to borrow money, and they needed to go to someone who wasn't Christian in order to borrow money, and that was the Jews. And this is why we see in the earlier part of this course, the Jews had become these important banking networks throughout Europe. Well, but we also saw in the early 13th century a lot of violence against Jews, and eventually most of the kings of Europe kicking Jews out of their countries. So where do people go to borrow money now? Well, the church is going to have to loosen its laws against Christians loaning money to Christians, and this creates a new need for bankers and all of the economic tools that go along with bankers. So it's an economic boom for a handful of people who figure out how to do this banking and accounting method. Thankfully, there had been the importation of important mathematical techniques from the Crusaders visiting the Eastern European areas. And so they have learned some very important ways to keep books. You need decimal systems to keep books. You need negative numbers. You need to be able to record credit and debit and profit and loss. You have to be able to figure out interest over the long period, that sort of thing. So it's a whole new set of skills that have to be brought to the fore. One of the largest and most important banking houses in the city of Florence is the Medici family. Florence is very well positioned because it can loan money to those merchants who want to do trading overseas, because it's very close to the ports, of Venice and Genoa and Pisa. So banking grows up thanks to one particularly wealthy family, the Medici family. That's a name you have to drill into your head. The de Medici family was will be influencing world politics and financials for centuries to come. There will even be a Medici Pope. They'll be involved in everything. They are essentially, if you're into conspiracy theories, they're the early Rothschild family. Anyway, so they're going to open up banks throughout Europe, in the major European cities, so that they can allow the transfer of funds. One thing that's going to aid them, come on, McAfee, give me a break, will be the fact that of Florentine politics. Florence at this moment, the early 13th century into the early 14th century, will be a republic. That means that they will have a number of oligarchs who will be running the city. They will not have a king, which is pretty unusual for most of Europe. They are following in the footsteps of the old Roman Republic. But as a city and as its own republic, they are minting their own coins, which you see the front and back of their coins. This is a florin. It was a gold coin minted in Florence. It has the symbol of the iris, one of the symbols of the city of Florence, but it also, on the front, where most of the other coins in Europe at this time had the picture of a king. It doesn't have a picture of a king. It has a picture of a person from the New Testament named John the Baptist, who was a preacher out in the wilderness, very different than the kings, who was the first person to identify Jesus of Nazareth, and he baptized Jesus and sent him on his mission. So John the Baptist was seen as a figure who could see into um, the future and point the way for what is coming into the future. So it's a symbol that Florence is saying, hey, we're a republic, we're the big up and coming thing, soon you'll all be republics. Doesn't work out that well, thanks to the de Medici family, but that's a story for another chapter. But these florins were solid gold. They were easily standardized, and they were accepted throughout Europe. They were the most trusted currency for quite a long time. Everyone wanted the florin, kind of like, oh, most of you are too young to remember, but I remember in the 1980s, it was very difficult it had been made illegal for most Americans to actually hold and use gold coins during the Great Depression. And so people bought gold coins as investments. And the most popular was a gold coin from South America called the Krugerrand. You saw commercials all the time. Oh, buy Krugerrands. They're very pretty. I don't know if they were a very good investment. Gold is an interesting investment, if only because now it runs opposite of the main economy. When sales and product and manufacturing is on its growth, then the price of gold tends to dip a little bit. But when you get down into bad economic times, the price of gold shoots up. So it's kind of an alternative method of understanding economics. And those of you who study business and economics probably know this far better than I do. But it was a very well-respected coin, and there were a lot of them made. And it was trusted because the banking houses of Florence were trusted. There were a lot of people out there trying to cheat, trying to make coins out of things other than gold. But the florin was very well respected and trusted throughout the world. So this is a new way of understanding the world. Debt and credit, profit and loss. Europe is growing up into something a little bit more recognizable. No more bartering chickens or anything. We're talking about real banks and real fiduciary value. Not to mention corporations, minimizing the risk. That was a big idea of this time, is that you incorporate so that, say, if you are a rich merchant and you want to, you spend your entire wealth buying goods to take somewhere to trade them, you load them all in the boat, goodbye, and the boat sinks. You're done for. That's everything. It's gone. And it doesn't even have to be your fault. So incorporating and making limited partnerships meant that you got a whole bunch of people who could afford to lose a little bit of money investing in a single ship. So that way, if the ship sinks, then everybody loses a little bit, with the idea of they're not putting in, the food that they need to eat the next day. They're using what's called capital. But if the boat comes back and everyone becomes a little bit more wealthy, no, it's not, you're not making a killing, but you're also not losing everything. Couple of other ways of knowing and understanding the world at this time. The invention of eyeglasses. Roger Bacon, in the late 13th century, is going to figure out that you can take glass and polish it in a certain way, in a certain shape. What makes a piece of glass magnify light is not the quality of the glass necessarily, it's the shape. It's that shape that we think of magnifying glasses. They're not flat glasses, they're curved, and that allows light going through glass. It comes out in different ways and it tends to magnify. These early eyeglasses were simply for magnification alone. This is, they didn't correct for astigmatism like mine does, near vision, far vision. It just magnified. But if you've ever looked at illuminated manuscripts and the writing of the time, it's hard to read if you've got good eyes. And if you get older, those of us who get older need reading glasses. We need magnification. Our eyes just are just not as sharp as you whippersnappers. And just that little bit of magnification that a set of eyeglasses could bring extended the working life of a scholar. If a scholar could no longer read, that was the end of his career. And so even just with a little bit of magnification, that's going to be an improvement. That's going to help a lot of people. Eyeglasses are going to become so popular that they will be made with fake lenses that don't do the amplification of light, just so people could wear them. I don't know why you would want to wear them. These things didn't have temple pieces. They were like the handle end of scissors, if you can imagine that, without the blade. So they're like the handle end of the scissors, and they pinched on your nose. They just kind of sat there, and some of the rims would be wooden. They might not have been very comfortable, but they did help a lot. Another thing that had been invented in China, but brought to the Europe, is the magnetic compass. The Chinese had figured out that if you take a needle, a sewing needle, and you rub it in silk, it magnetizes it. It gives it a magnetic charge. And if you put that needle on a cork in water, it always points to the same direction. Now, they didn't understand the magnetic pole per se, but they could tell that it was about the same direction as the North Star. The North Star is a very accurate way to navigate, because it is essentially right above the axis of the Earth, right above what we call the North Pole. And so when we spin around at night, it doesn't seem to move. It moves a tiny bit, but very imperceptibly. So over the course of the night, you can watch the rest of the stars seemingly spin around it. And this star, the quality of the star, had been known by the ancient Greeks. They had a legend about it. The Big Dipper, they didn't call it the Big Dipper, it was the Great Bear, Ursa Major. And uh, the uh, the story was about the bear had uh, insulted one of the gods, and so the god put it up into the heavens and would not allow it to be able to drink. And so the Great Dipper moves around the star Polaris and never gets close enough to the ocean to drink. Um, the So it was a fantastic uh, pointer star to understand the heavens and be able to determine things. If you have ever been up all night on a starry night, you can almost tell time. If you can, you're watching how things are going. When I was a firefighter in the California wildlands, we would be up all night fighting forest fires. And I remember being out in the woods and being able to look up and say, okay, it's about this time. I was usually pretty close. When you kind of start watching the patterns, you could kind of see what time of night it was. But sailors in the Middle Ages did not sail at night. Why? You can't see. It was too easy to run into rocks. It was too easy to run into sandbars. It was too dangerous. So sailing at night, when you could best navigate, not a good idea. But a magnetic compass, like this one, allowed you to sail during the day. That you didn't depend on the sun, which was constantly moving and covered in clouds on a rainy day. This was not affected by rain. This was rarely, it was affected by large amounts of iron, which is why good compass cases are always brass. Brass is not, cannot be magnetized, so it's not affected by it. But it's quite constant. And you could sail out of the side of land with this. If you knew your maps, knew where you were going, and you knew that the place you wanted to go was at a certain degree, and if you knew where north was, you could use the compass directions to figure out which way you were going. And if you could used this compass, this is a copy of a sundial that my husband and son gave to me for Christmas. A sundial, an early way of telling time by the sun. But this gnomon, this thing is called the gnomon, the pointer, and then you've got the hours listed here. This gnomon has to be pointed in a particular direction, north. So if this is glass, so you can see on the inside to see the compass, and you can point it directly north, and then I think it actually has to go north. Yeah. So you would point it north, and then you'd put it out in the sunlight, and you can see the time. So this kind of use of a magnetic compass and a sundial would have been a major boon to navigation. Or if you were a businessman or, traveling along the Silk Road, this would have been very handy to have along with you. So you would know where you, approximately where you are and where you were going. Makes it much easier to use maps that way. Also, maps. Maps became something very important. I'll show it. It's easier for me to show it to you than to actually describe it. These early maps were called portolani, usually on vellum, calfskin, or sometimes they could be drawn on silk. Silk would have been nice because you could have folded it up very nicely, but it is a rather accurate representation of Europe. This is the Mediterranean Sea, Spain, the north of France, England, Scandinavia. There are a lot of details here that would make it very helpful if you were a merchant or a sailor, that you could be standing here on the end of uh, the toe of the Italian peninsula. And if you wanted to go to Tunisia, you would know that Tunisia is at a certain direction. So you could sail out of the sight of land, and hopefully not run into things with the magnetic compass and this Portolani. Now, it kind of looks like there are gradiated lines. Those are actually the names of ports written extraordinarily small. And it would be like Google reading the directions. You would know which port. If you landed at a port, you would know that if you turned, oh, please. If you turned one way, you would go to these ports. If you turned the other way, you could go to these ports. So you could figure out where you were going very nicely. So this would be very important information for any sailor or anyone moving around the Mediterranean. But of course, mechanical clocks. Mechanical clocks are really going to change the imaginations and the understanding of Europe. Before mechanical clocks, they had water clocks that were somewhat accurate. They had hourglasses that, if you forgot to turn them, you've blown it for the day. They had the sundials that you could pull out. But what happens when it's cloudy? A mechanical clock allows you to give a consistent length to the hour. Now that seems weird. However, before the mechanized clock becomes successful, hours got bigger or smaller depending on the time of year. What? Yes. They divided the day and the night into 12 hours, 12 hours of day, 12 hours of night. Well, we know, wait a minute, it's only 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night if you're living, closer to the equator on the equinox. That's what they mean, equal night. The day is equal to the night. But they kept that division of 12 hours, even though in the winter, the nights would be very long and the days would be very short. So that 12 hour of days, they would imagine those hours being shorter and the nights hours being longer. This is one way before the mechanical clock that they described time passing. But hours didn't mean that much because they didn't, think about hours that much. They thought about position of the sun. Well, when you're dealing with the sun during the day, it's either rising at its very peak or setting, and everything in between is kind of, okay, maybe if you know what direction you're looking at. But mechanical clock. That clicking of the seconds, making each second like the last one, making the future seconds like the ones that had gone before, making each minute 60 seconds, making each hour 60 minutes. That kind of accuracy and continuity creates for a different mindset and understanding about time. So the mechanical clocks, all of the gearing and the movement is all based on that water wheel and those windmills with the elaborate gearing and everything. All you need to do is getting an axle moving. Once you get an axle moving, you pull gears off of it, you make the teeth so big and you make the gear wheels big, and eventually you can get it to work at a sustainable rate. And these were probably gravity clocks, which meant that the axle was actually turned very slowly by chains that pulled it down. And then it would have to be reset manually, and then it would pull again. Spring mechanisms were not Um, not quite there yet when we're talking about the 13th and early 14th century. But these mechanical clocks had to be big, no watches, no clocks on the walls. They were huge. And so it made sense to install them in the main square on the side of the city hall, so to at sometimes. This is the Orlog, uh, or the main clock at the Old Town City Hall in Prague. It is still running. It has been running off and on since the 14th century when it was built. And it was a wonder when it was built, and it still gathers crowds even today because it puts on a real show. On the hour the hour rings, this golden rooster starts crowing. It's really shocking. It starts crowing and it's animated, so it kind of jiggles up and down, kind of like the rooster in Wegmans on Highway 28. And then these windows open and there is a procession of saints. They're carved statues that move around. They've been geared. The clock is a 24-hour clock. It moves only once around, or the hands move only once around a day. So there's no repeat. And these little figurines start moving. They start doing little dances. So it's kind of like a Disney animatronic thing that was invented in the 14th century. It has, as I said, the 24-hour clock, but it also has a gearing window so that you can see the phases of the moon and the signs of the zodiac as well. So here's your astrology coming into play. But it also has this curious clock. This moves around once a year. It tells the day, and that is basically, it tells you the saint's day. In the Roman Catholic Church, it was tradition to make several days Saint's Day, like St. Valentine's Day, or St. Patrick's Day, or St. Crispin's Day, or St. Anne's Day. And generally speaking, there are more saints than there are days. So there was lots of doubling up. It could be St. Anne's Day and St. John's Day at the same time, which is good because it became a tradition in many European countries that you were named after the saint of the day you were born on. So if you knew someone who was named, I don't know, Václav, Wenceslas, St. Wenceslas, you knew when that person's birthday was, and that was when it was St. Wenceslas Day. Better than Facebook and its birthday notifications. I'm kidding. I know you're all too cool to use Facebook. Anyway, but these mechanical clocks are going to get people interested in this kind of machinery. It's extraordinarily useful. Now, a lot of the old cities had these kind of clocks, and every one of these cities that has one of these ancient clocks pretty much has the story that the king loved the clock so much that he had the engineer blinded so he couldn't make any more clocks, so that they would have the only spectacular clock. Maybe it happened once, but that everybody has that story, that's a little bit puzzling to me. But running the world on these clocks is going to be Facebook's no longer cool. That's what I hear. That's what my son tells me. So these clocks get everybody's attention, even back then. And all of a sudden you can say, meet me at 3 rather than meet me, sometime after lunch. And it regulates daily life. And it makes people less dependent upon the church bells. See, the church bells had been given at certain times during the day in order to call people to mass or in order to announce when certain prayers should be said, matins and evening prayers and that sort of thing, but they were not accurate. They just happened at the traditional time, as opposed to now people are dependent upon time that is secular, that is in the public square. And that moves their focus to something different. Also, the idea of time equaling money. If you're charging interest, you need to know how many days have passed, how many hours, how to figure out compound interest. So the concept of time equaling money is huge and very important. So I want to stop right here, take a break. I'll stop the recording or pause it. And if we can have a 15-minute break and come back at 12:45 to continue. And I'm going to go off a few minutes because I need to get something, some coffee to drink. But if you guys want to chat, I'm going to leave this open for you in case you do. I'm going to go upstairs and get some coffee. But if you want to chat between yourselves, I have no. All right. Hello, everybody. I got my coffee. I'm happy now. Before we go on, are there any questions? Usually about this time, I get questions about the final. And as it's listed on the syllabus, the final will be given on May 7th. It will be at 10 a.m. I can only give it to you at that time, and you will have 2 hours to finish it. Most people ask what's on it. If you recall the 5 topics that I'm basing the quizzes on: government, religion, art, communications, and technology. I will ask 1 question per each of those topics. You will choose 2 of them and write about them. So it's a brief essay, but it's all done online. Okay. So since time equals money, we move on. And we have intellectuals getting into what is happening, looking at the world in a little bit different way. And one of the instructors and intellectuals who will be focused on a re-examining of the world will be a monk named William of Ockham. It will only cover chapters 7 through 14. So that I should have typed that only. Okay, great. Thank you very much for asking. So here we see a drawing of William of Ockham, although I think it is a copy of a stained glass window of him. But you can see he's holding his hand awkwardly. He's using his mnemonic from his rote learning. He is remembering certain passages that needs to be remembered. So there you go. They actually did use that mnemonic. Anyway, William of Ockham is living, I believe, in England. And he is going against what Thomas Aquinas, who taught in Paris, had written in his work Summa Theologica about how to understand God. Thomas Aquinas wrote that faith could be justified by reason, that you could use logic and rhetoric to understand God. William of Ockham will question that, probably because what happens to those people who do not get an education in logic and rhetoric, which was the majority of Europe? Could they not understand God? Because Thomas Aquinas said you needed reason to understand God. William of Ockham said that the existence of God could be demonstrated other ways, through revelation and through scriptural revelation. So direct revelation and scriptural revelation. You don't have to use logic and reason to find him. But he says you can apply logic and reason to those things we can see or touch or taste or smell or hear. Those things of the natural world, we can use logic and reason to better understand them. So we can use spiritual revelation to understand God. He's outside of the realm of human logic and human reason. But those things that are here on earth, we could apply our logic and reason to better understand them. He was a leader in a movement known as nominalism, which stated that only individual things are real. That goes against an earlier idea called Platonism, which is after the Greek philosopher Plato. Plato believed that there was such a thing as a perfect thing, and that everything that was the same as that thing was a part of that thing, but that you could eventually achieve a perfect thing. The way it was described to me is that there is a perfect chair somewhere in the universe, and every other chair is a part of that perfect chair. To which William of Ockham says, wait a minute, a chair is made out of wood. A chair is cut and formed and put together by humans. We understand a chair by understanding the materials in it and how it is formed and how it is used. Not, we don't understand that chair by picturing in our mind and looking towards the perfect chair. So nominalism, we're not thinking about this vast, perfect chair. We are thinking about individual things that are real. And this is going to be a major influence in medieval universities, going against Thomas Aquinas. Oh my goodness. And it's going to change how people are going to perceive the world. Also, as far as the old idea of Platonism, you could understand chairs by understanding the perfect chair, or you could understand the perfect chair by knowing a local chair. And William of Ockham says, no, you understand chairs by examining a chair. You don't have to look for that perfect item. And so William of Ockham is going to throw parts of Plato's ideas out the window. So he's against Plato, and he's against some of what Thomas Aquinas is writing. But what William of Ockham's thoughts are going to lead to is the study or the idea of empiricism, that the knowledge of the world rests on examination and using our five senses and logic and reason. This is a first baby step towards science. So the empirical model is important, and that demands looking at evidence and examining evidence and coming to conclusions based on evidence. There will be a later philosopher by the name of Bertrand Russell in the 20th century who will come up with a principle in logic called Occam's razor. And you might run into it at some point. William of Ockham did not write Occam's razor. It comes from his writing, but he did not write Occam's razor. Bertrand Russell, in using Occam's thinking, puts forward the idea that if you've got two explanations for the same phenomena, then go with the explanation that has the best evidence rather than the explanation that depends on evidence and imagination or assumptions. The example I always use for this is the building of the pyramids. We don't know exactly how the pyramids were built. Not quite. There's lots of arguments still, but there are two camps that you see nowadays. One is that humans built the pyramids at the time, and another camp says ancient aliens built the pyramids at their time. So we can use Occam's razor and the writings of William of Ockham to understand or to come to a conclusion. So let's look at the idea that humans built the pyramids. What kind of evidence do we have? Well, we have drawings and carvings of humans building pyramids. Those could have been fake, those could have been done ages ago, but we have them. We have writings of the time that the pyramids were built, talking about building the pyramids. We have the pyramids themselves where we can see the cuts that were made and ways that they could have been stacked. We can see the writings of other people at other times who saw the pyramids and said, yes, they were built by so-and-so at such and such time. We have the dormitories that the workers lived in. We have these huge housing complexes that were used by the workers of the pyramid, and they had beer brewing vats and they have giant ovens, and they obviously housed a lot of people for a specific period of time. We have their tools, that at points they dropped them or left them or got part of the work done, and so we can see exactly how the work is being done. And we have graffiti from the workers themselves who said, we laid down so many stones, beat that, ha, ha, ha. So it was this team competition sort of thing to build the stones. So we have that kind of evidence. Now, what about what's coming up on the ancient aliens side? Well, we have this idea that these stones were so big, humans couldn't lift them. But we have evidence that they could have or did. So we assume ancient aliens. Well, first we have to assume there are ancient aliens because we have no physical evidence of ancient aliens. We have to assume they cared enough to come to Earth. We have to assume that they had faster than light travel. We can't do it. We don't know how it's done. So we have to assume because they came from somewhere else. We usually say, oh, well, you needed these huge tractor beams and laser cutting equipment to cut these stones and lift them up and put them in place. Well, where are they? We don't have any of that equipment. We don't know how it works. We don't see evidence of laser cutting on stone. And a laser cut would have left a certain type of evidence, and we do not see that. So you see what I'm saying? These assumptions start piling up on the other side, whereas Occam's razor said, look, we've got this evidence. We might not know exactly how it happened, but we have to make too many assumptions if we're going to say ancient aliens made them. So let's go with the human built pyramids. Anyway, talking about philosophy is difficult. I am no philosopher. I did take philosophy in college. I enjoyed it very much. I like to hear people argue about it, but it just seems like wordplay to me some of the times. Anyway, but it's an important move in the development of humans, so we need to talk about it. It tells us what that the people of that time, what their values were, what their worldviews were. I remember when I was in high school, and then later when I went to community college, I really wanted a philosophy. I really wanted a worldview, and I took philosophy classes and said, "Oh yeah, I like this worldview. I'm going to follow that." And it would always seem to get to some point that I say, "Well, that's stupid," and then move on to the next one. So, I've almost given up on my search, but I digress. Sorry about that. So, changes in literature. Literature, as until we start getting into this era, that we see, and we saw this last chapter, that we see people writing in Latin for theological purposes or to forward an argument in philosophy or legal matters or government matters. So it's all religion and government. And what about people who just wanted to read for enjoyment? There were those people. And in fact, at this time, we're seeing more and more people reading for enjoyment. What did they have to read? Well, we have some handfuls of the literature that they wrote, and we find that we can point to basically one man, an Italian by the name of Dante Alighieri, who was a theologian, brilliant, read the classics, understood Latin very, very well, but he contended that, not everyone can read Latin. And so he starts to write in Italian, not in Latin. And he writes a poem, and it's a very long poem, called the Divine Comedy. And it is broken into 3 parts, labeled Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. So those are the 3 parts of his work: Inferno, Purgatorio, and can't read it. Sorry about that. Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. This poem is a journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise, or heaven. The premise of the poem is that a poet, we assume Dante himself, has just lost the love of his life, named Beatrice, and he wants to find her. This is kind of an old trope in Greek mythology. Orpheus descends, an Orpheus who is a poet and a musician descends into hell to find his wife Eurydice. So this is not a new idea. However, what Dante brings is an understanding of Italian, writing in a very beautiful form that basically says we think that the Italian language is beautiful enough to write in for its own purpose, not to put everything in Latin. And it is Dante's descriptions of hell, inferno, that truly create our modern understanding of hell. Now, I made a video on Dante and the Inferno that my husband and I shot in our old stomping grounds uh, near a volcano. And if I have not posted it, I will make sure I have posted it. And I explain a lot more about Dante and what his poem was about. So I'm going to leave that up to you to watch, but I'll make sure it's in the module. So I'm going to skip a little bit forward on Dante. Dante's writing for not a church audience, but the laity, the average person. He's, in fact, if you read Dante's Inferno, he puts into hell, certain levels of hell, people that are readily recognizable, including popes. Because at this moment, we're seeing the papacy, and this is just the hierarchy of the church, the very establishment part of it, not the regular people, not everyone in the church, but there is suspicion coming against the Pope, partially because the Pope is afraid for his own life. Multiple popes are. There are contending groups in the Italian peninsula, each of which favor different popes for different political or familial reasons. Families have these dynastic families in the Italian peninsula have a huge sway in the politics because they are personally involved, if not actually ruling cities. And so this idea of mob violence in order to get your way, it's very relevant in the Italian peninsula, to the point at which you've got two rival groups who are arguing about who should be pope every time that there is a new election of a new pope. The pope, various popes have to move around the Italian peninsula to stay ahead of the mob, to keep them from beating them up, until at one point one of the popes is almost beaten to death by a mob. And so the next pope that is elected decides to move to the safest place he can think of on the Italian peninsula, and that is France. He moves out of Italy altogether and moves into a spectacular castle in the south of France, in a city called Avignon. Still there, castle is still there. And I believe I have some video of that, and I will put that up. But from 1309 to 1378, the Pope did not live in Rome. The Pope lived in Avignon. And not just the Pope, all of the administration, all of the bureaucracy, many of the bishops, all of that structure moved out of Rome and into this palace. It was the largest palace built at the time, and it's spectacular. But it meant that for people who become nominated as bishop, they're nominating Frenchmen. These French bishops, I mean, it didn't matter where the bishops were, he's putting Frenchmen in that place. In return, when they need a new pope, these majority French bishops return to Avignon, to the conclave, and they elect French popes. This means that the French king now has a huge amount of power when it comes to the pope, because they're very closely aligned. But it also means that those states, the papal states in central Italian peninsula that the Pope was the lord of the manor on, so to speak. That the Pope had a certain amount of property, and that's how he raised funds to help run the church. Well, those were no longer properly in the hands of the Pope. And so the new popes in Avignon, building bigger castles, running their bureaucracy, decided that they needed more money. So they're going to impose taxes and obligations on all the churches. So they're going to tell all the bishops throughout Europe, raise more money, charge taxes, or sell offices. And this is a very dangerous thing. It's called simony. Selling of offices. Simony. And that's basically bribery. There's no two ways about it. That means that you're not offering the offices to someone who deserves it, but the person who can pay for it. It's essentially bribery. And so this is going to be looked upon with suspicion by the laity and by those nobles and kings who are not French, because now they're paying a lot more money to the church, many more obligations that they believe they need in order to gain salvation. And the popes in doing this are looking very much like the regular kings, who are seen oftentimes as very avarice, very greedy, very political, creatures of secular ideas and virtues, not sacred. And so this is undermining the Pope's authority, his moral authority. Also, they're seeing this giant castle in Avignon as a luxury area. There is, and you can visit the treasury, which is approximately a room. It's a very good sized room, windows way high up, so you can't get into it except by a particularly strong locked door, and that's where they kept the money. And when I visited it, there weren't any coins there, but they describe stacks and bags and boxes and coffers of coins. And all I could imagine was Scrooge McDuck diving into his safe filled with this pool of coins that he goes swimming through and tosses gold coins in the air. You get that vibe when you get into the room. And it became difficult to find places to hide all these coins, to put them all, to the point that they were taking buckets of coins and lifting up the stones that made the floors of these rooms, digging them out a little bit, and putting the buckets in these underneath these stones and covering it with these big heavy stones. We know that because in the very early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte of France had taken control of this palace, of the papal palace. By that time, it was very worn down. It wasn't quite so spectacular. And he was remodeling it to make a stable for his horses so he could keep his cavalry units there. And in moving the stones around, they found buckets of coins that date from this period, 1309 to 1378. So the luxury was real, but it was seen as unseemly. It was seen as, this is way too much for a pope who's supposed to be a man of God. Also, there will be charges, accusations against some of the popes doing things that really are bad, like being bribed, selling the offices, and sexual transgressions. Whether these accusations were justified, the record needs to be examined on that. Maybe they were, maybe they were not. Anyway, so the Babylonic captivity, that they call this, of the papacy, it's going to be a real dark mark on the Pope. And when in about 1378 there is an attempt to fix it, it all goes very wrong. But we'll get to that next chapter. So we have this time, this middle of the 13th century, is going to see the secular rulers trying to get more power, that we see stronger and stronger territorial monarchies. We had seen England change into a constitutional monarchy. We had seen France become an absolute monarch in terms of a very centralized political structure. Well, now they're reaching out and creating a much more sophisticated kingdom, that they're making more laws, the king is, and that they are using their hard power to push people around, to charge more taxes, because kings always need more money, and put out propaganda to let people know what great kings they are. For example, this image right here, a painting done around the time that we're talking about. Here is the King of France. We can tell by his symbol, the fleur de lis, the lily of the field. He is in his beautiful, sumptuous chambers. These are all elegant tapestries that, of course, match his robe. Go ahead, make the tapestries in your room match your clothes. That's pretty weird, but anyway. So we see the king in all of his splendor, and he is being presented by a person with a crown on. So obviously another royal, not a noble, another royal. Nobles were not allowed to wear crowns, only royals. And we see from the emblems on this robe that this is probably a royal, a prince, perhaps a king from England, that these lions. It's probably England from what I have seen. The idea that a king of England would come to a French monarch and kneel before him would be unthinkable. No love between the two at this time at all. In fact, we're talking about a period, I'm going to talk about it in a minute, called the 100 Years' War. So this is obvious propaganda done by having, paid for by the French king to show his power over the English monarchs. No, that's just quite fanciful on the face of it. The monarchs are going to want to be sure they have strong ties with the church, so that they can claim spiritual and moral improvement of the realm. So they're going to be sending more money to the church so that the church will continue to support them and grant them legitimacy. Mutual dependency. The king depends on the church depends upon the king and his hard power. But these claims to sovereignty, that the idea that they rule a bigger and bigger territory and have the right to rule a bigger and bigger territory, you can use as much propaganda as you want. You can use as many decrees and laws and statements and whatever you can churn out. What makes a monarch or a sovereign truly legitimate is hard power, real power, force, which means men at arms. And sovereignty is won by force and kept by force. If you want a larger and larger territory for your monarch, you have to take territory from your neighbor because they ain't making more land in Europe. So this desire by these territorial monarchs to have more and more land means that they're going to be perpetually at war with each other. So these wars are going to come at a particularly interesting moment because between the years 1000 and 1300, kind of bracketing the period we're talking about, the population in Europe is going to triple. It's going to triple because the weather is going to get better. We're going to have a warming trend during those 300 years. It's a natural warming trend, not man-made. It will just naturally occur. And how can we tell if they didn't have thermometers? Well, we get written reports of crops that we know are warm weather crops growing in areas they can't grow today. England is harvesting winemaking grapes in England, which they could not before. They are able to do at this time. And of course, they don't know climatology. They have no real scientific understanding of it. They just are opportunistic. Hey, we can grow this stuff here. Let's do it. But because the population is eating better, there's more of them, they're living longer, they need more food. That puts more pressure on the land. You're not getting more land. And so you're turning that land that you maybe had ignored or were using for forestry or was marshy and you just kind of ignored it because it was too hard to fix. You're going into that land and you're turning it into farmland, basically to create more wheat, more grapes for wine. That was the big demand. So it is a kind of a marginal diet. Your diet, they're getting rid of the forests, they're draining the marshes with canals, and they're reducing pasture land. The moment you reduce the pasture land, there goes livestock. And that means meat, that means dairy, that means wool and sheep, the hair off of sheep. So there's a lot of things that you need for your society that go away when you start reducing your pasture land. But that was how great the demand was for wheat. And even at that, even with those drastic measures, Europe is able to feed itself just barely. If anything happens to upset this careful balance, it's all going to go tumbling down. So you can guess what's going to happen. The balance gets disturbed. It gets disturbed because this lovely warming climate that they had all of a sudden switches back and goes back to cold, goes back to what it was before the warming period, this 300 years warming period. The rainfall patterns change, there's shorter growing seasons involved, and agricultural production plummets. So you get these adverse weather patterns and you get colder and longer winters. Now I love this depiction of a peasant farm in winter. No, they did not build houses without walls. The artist left the walls out so you could clearly see inside the house where everyone is warming themselves by the fire, the little smoke coming out, and they're washing all of their underwear in and having it all dried out, but everything is locked up nice and tight for the winter. You've got animals, and yes, the animals are living very close to the humans. This is an important factor coming up. Um, Beehives, honey was the only source of sweetener, so people kept beehives. You've got people cutting down what little forest is left because, well, you got to have those fires going, and everybody heated with fires. Absolutely everybody heated and cooked on fires. You also have a nice silo here, which is where you kept the food for the animals, although you've got some hay racks here as well, but that's always kind of a dangerous way. It can mildew very quickly, and mildewed hay makes animals very sick. Um, and I love this person, can't tell if it's a man or a woman because both peasants, uh, women wore longer dresses, men wore very long shirts, um, and on occasion pants, but usually very long shirts. Anyway, probably, I'm guessing from the attitude, this person is coming back from the outhouse. Ooh, that would have been a cold trip. Anyway, so imagine longer winters spent in this way, but not being able to produce so much. That you've got bad weather patterns that change the growing season. All of a sudden, a crop that your father planted and was able to plant successfully, now you can't get it to grow anymore. What are you going to do? Because you grew up learning that method of planting, and all of a sudden, change? What's that? That hits this population rather hard. Human actions make it worse. They can't stop holding wars. And of course, what is happening when wars are being fought, people are being killed, of course, property is getting destroyed, but at the same time, you're not planting. Um, and so you're not able to grow as much food. So we will see, beginning in the very early part of the 14th century, in the very early part of the 1300s, uh, famine. Famine like Europe had not seen in a very long time, and that there will be reports of people dying uh, on the roads, people eating bark off of the trees just to have something in their stomach. And most importantly, there are many diseases that can come from getting insufficient vitamins and minerals, scurvy from insufficient vitamin C, rickets from insufficient vitamin D, et cetera, et cetera. And long time famine, 7 years of famine, that is going to affect the children. That the development of children during this time, they're going to become weaker. Everybody's immune system is going to get very weak. And so if anything really bad was to happen, I mean, 7 years of famine killed 10 to 15% of the people in Europe during this weird little 7-year European-wide famine. That could be considered really, 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 really awful. And it can't get worse, can it? You haven't been in my class long, have you? Because it's going to get very worse. Because in the Black Sea, right in the center, right in the very heart of the Silk Road and the Mongolian Empire, the Pax Mongolica, there will be a city that is mainly a colony of the Genoese merchants and sailors. These are merchants and sailors who come from a city on the west coast of the Italian peninsula, and they trade regularly on this route, and so they had set up a big colony. And all of a sudden, this horrible disease, this plague, hits the city. And many of these merchants and sailors panic, jump on ships, and do the absolute worst thing they could. head to Europe. They're trying to get away from this deadly plague. They don't know what causes it. They just know everybody's getting it. And they suspect, this is a common suspicion of this time, that it is the plague is actually in the air, that you get it by breathing in this polluted air that they called miasma. So this is the miasma idea of plague. It's wrong. But these sailors and these merchants will jump on ships and sail back, and they will land in 1347 in a small town in Sicily, a port town in Sicily. And those that are still surviving get off the boat. And that's when the disease starts, because they've just brought it to Europe. Now, some of them of the people had brought it by their infection. We understand the vectors of this disease, the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, as they called it. It is a microbe, Yersinia pestis. This microbe infects fleas, and these fleas infect rats. And if they move around in the rats, on occasion, these fleas, infected fleas, will get on people and bite the people. Unfortunately, this is a vector that no one could understand and they couldn't stop, because rats get on ships. Ships and rats are a common problem. So the infected rats from the city in the Black Sea get on the ship, and these sailors and merchants bring death with them. They land, and the rats get off the ship. And that's it. There's no stopping it. People at the time saw rats a lot. Yeah, they thought they were disgusting, but you can't kill off all the rats. So, you did what you could to mitigate the rats getting in your food and stuff and getting in your house, but they're all over the place. You can't stop them. What about the fleas? I mean, today we would be horrified if our dog brought in fleas and we got all fleas on us. Back then, people had lice, people had fleas. It was not that uncommon. You couldn't quite get rid of it. So an additional flea bite was not noticed. It was as if, here in Virginia, we get mosquito bites. We don't think about it. In Africa, that's the last thing you want to have happen, is being bit by a mosquito. That's why I have mosquito nets. That's why they use all sorts of mosquito prevention, because in Africa they have malaria. The mosquitoes here, knock on wood, are not infected with malaria. It is because of mosquito-borne malaria that people who travel to Africa get a tablet that right now is in the news, hydroxy chloroquine is a pill that's given to travelers in Africa to fight malaria. It's been out for quite some time. Anyway, back to Yersinia pestis. So it's carried by fleas on the rats. So you could get it. The rats can be affected by it, and if a rat was to bite you, then you would get it as well. So you'd get it by flea bite, and you would get it by rat bite. That's just the beginning. The initial run of this plague, the Black Death, is so called because of how it affects the human body. It gets into the lymphatic system. Now, those are, you have lymph nodes in your throat, you have lymph nodes underneath your arms, you have lymph nodes in your groin. Most of you have probably been inoculated against mumps. I wasn't. I had it. I have pictures of myself with my throat swollen so badly I couldn't lower my chin It's like I was a chipmunk smuggling walnuts, and it was extraordinarily painful. But mumps are in your lymph nodes. It makes it swell up. Well, the bubonic plague not only makes your lymph nodes swell up, especially under your arms, they turn black. I mean, they fill up with blood, and they're extraordinarily painful. So those swellings underneath the arm, the black swellings, are called buboes, which is why we call it the bubonic plague or the Black Death. Because people have these horrible, icky swellings and they're all black. That was one way this disease was carried. This form of the disease gave you a horrible fever, dysentery, swelling, pain, an unquenchable thirst, and then you were down for like 2 weeks, and you either recovered or you died. This was virulent, but not the most virulent form of this disease. And this was one of the things that was the most frightening about the Black Death, was in fact it had 3 separate manifestations. Bubonic in the lymph nodes, made your lymph nodes swell up. 2 weeks was the limit that it was. You either lived or died in those 2 weeks. The second way it was transferred, and this was often by bites of rats or coming into contact with the fluid, the bodily fluids of anyone who was infected. The second way is septicemic. That means it gets into your blood system. It is a blood poisoning, and that killed within 3 days. And that was particularly virulent. That was particularly ugly way to do it. But if you had someone who was infected with bubonic plague or someone who was septicemic, there was a third way they transmitted this disease, and that was pneumonic. That was your breath. Just what they're warning us about COVID-19. Don't breathe on people. Don't be around people that cough. Well, that's exactly how this pneumonic version of it spread. However, that pneumonic version killed within hours. We have written reports of people who were perfectly fine when they went to work or to market in the morning and never came home that night, that they got the cough and they died. So it was virulent, it was very quick, and it horrified people. And it was especially bad because, of course, coughing is a symptom. People around here, we cough a lot because of, like me, I've got seasonal allergies very badly. So when we're talking about COVID-19 and people are coughing, everyone's like, COVID-19, run away. Same exact idea in medieval Europe at this time, except that, remember, everybody heated with wood fires. Wood fires are particularly bad about putting particulates in the air, but they had to keep fires going to cook all day and to heat the homes, so everybody coughed because of just the massive amounts of particulate matter they breathed in during the course of the day. So people are coughing a lot. And this different manifestations made the disease incredibly terrifying for everybody. And it was terrifying because it affected everybody. It didn't matter if you were a king, if you were a noble, if you were a pope, if you were a bishop, if you were a peasant, if you were a merchant. It struck everybody the same. They figure approximately half of the population got the disease, but at least a third of the population of Europe died from it. So a third of the population was gone. And that didn't just happen once. The disease just didn't go through and next year it's gone. It hung around for 300 years. It came back and then it would go away. And it was so mysterious, people didn't know what to think about it. They panicked. someone in their family would cough, they'd be assume that that person had the disease, and they would abandon that person. Not only abandon that person, they would, as they're running away, nail the doors shut so that person could not spread the disease. Well, we know with COVID-19, people can have it for 4 days and not have any symptoms at all. They didn't know anything about this. So that panic, that resignation, we're all going to die, because they had no way of knowing it was going to stop someday. They had no cures. Doctors could do absolutely nothing. There was lots of home remedies, lots of ideas. People wore amulets, etc. Now, the good news, maybe, do you think that Yersinia pestis, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, is gone? It isn't. This particular microbe is still around, still in fleas, but these fleas infect chipmunks, especially chipmunks west of the Rocky Mountains of the United States. Approximately a dozen people a year contract bubonic plague. And hopefully, those people get to the right doctors. Very few people die of it in the United States, but it is there, and it is something to be concerned about. So if you ever go camping or visiting national parks west of the Rocky Mountains, do not play with the chipmunks. Do not play with the chipmunks. Anyway, but going back to the Middle Ages, it was people panicking, partially because it moved so quickly. It started down here, December of 1937. It's going to be all the way up to Russia by 1350. So it spreads incredibly quickly. And some places it will avoid and then come back. Or it will miss some places completely and entirely. Never go there. There is a village in the mountains of Germany that they promised. The village got together and made a pact and prayed to the Virgin Mary that if she protected them from the plague, they would put on the entire village would put on a play about the last week of Christ, a passion play. And they did that, and they never got the plague. So they did it the next year, and they never got the plague. They did it the next year, and they never got the plague. But this village, Omer Gabberbau, puts on this play every year, and the entire village acts in it. They all, they dress up as the Roman soldiers and everything. And the village never got the plague. Oftentimes when you visit Europe, you will find tall columns with a statue of the Mary, Mother of Jesus on top. These columns are called Marian columns, but they also have another name, a plague column, because these columns were put there to thank the Virgin Mary for interceding on the part of the city and sparing some people from the plague. Of course, they're looking for scapegoats because they did not understand microbes. So, of course, they're going to blame the Jews for poisoning the wells. And so they're going to have massive attacks on the Jewish communities throughout Europe. Now, in the Muslim-held territories where Jews did live very openly, they did not have these kind of attacks because the Muslims understood the transmission, how the kind of, after a fashion, how this virus was transmitted. And so they didn't blame the Jews. So it was a very anti-Semitic European reaction. Another reaction of this, of the people, was that they thought the Black Death was the wrath of God poured out on them because they were insufficiently pious, or maybe the church was suspect. And so the only way to please God was to be self-sacrificing. This was a notion that a handful of people did. So they held themselves up as basically a sacrifice to rescue towns. These people were called flagellants, and they moved in small groups to towns. They would appear to towns, they'd come into the marketplace, they'd start saying prayers, singing songs, offering to do penance, and then they would start whipping themselves with whips. And the crowds would gather and people would get hysterical, and sometimes the townspeople would join in, and there was wailing and blood flying. It was a horrible thing, but it was mass hysteria. But that's how panicked these people were. The secular and religious authorities found that this was rather dangerous because, you see, these people could be spreading the disease as well. So the flagellants were banned in many places in Europe. And in fact, at some places, they had to be rounded up and burned at the stake for heresy because they kept doing this. They couldn't stop them from doing this. If you and it comes from a purely a devout position, a position to be pious. They were self-sacrificing. If you look up the Philippines during the Holy Week, the Christian Holy Week, which is Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday, in the Philippines, they often have flagellants. They often have people who offer themselves up as sacrifices. They will beat themselves. And some of these people, a handful of these people, will have themselves crucified as sacrifices. Now, they only stay that way for a few minutes. And some people do it year after year, but it comes from this this desire to wipe away sin. So it is a notion that is to most of us pretty crazy, but it comes from a very sincere place. But I have to end this chapter on a downer. The Europeans thought they were truly going to die, that this was the end of history, that the apocalypse had come, the end of the world was here, everybody was going to die, there was nothing they could do to stop it. And that was the feeling for 3 centuries in some places. But it's going to be guaranteed to change people in very important ways. When we come back Tuesday, and I start on chapter 11, we're going to see a world that is changed drastically. And I hope you're there. I hope you're paying attention, because one day we're going to be through with COVID-19, and we're going to be through with sheltering in place. And we're all going to go back, maybe to work, maybe to exactly what we did, but maybe our world will be changed. We've got a presidential election coming up. We have things that are going through our government that are changing. We have religious movements that are changing. And so we will have the same opportunity the people in Europe did after they get through with this disease, or after mostly it's gone, to change the world. And so I want you to pay particularly close attention to some of the things they do. Hopefully it will give you some insights into maybe what we can do with our own lives. Does anybody have any questions? Going forward? Okay, if you do have any questions, contact me by email. I will see you. Oh, please, on Canvas. Oh, where will the final take place? It will be on Canvas. So you will be doing it at home. You don't have to come in to classes. And I have a private note from Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, hang on. For everybody else, I hope you have a good weekend. I hope you stay safe. And because I'm eager to see you back here on Tuesday. Video from the last lecture. Okay. Yeah, I'll explain that to you, Elizabeth. I hopefully have the last lecture, chapter 9. I would be putting that up. I had some technical difficulties, so I have to fix it a little bit. So that's why it's not up yet. So I'll get it up as soon as possible. So keep an eye out for it. This is also an even numbered lecture, so that means we have a quiz coming up on that. So I will post that within the next day or so. So be watching Canvas for that as well. As usual, I will give you a week to finish that quiz. All right. Thank you all very much. Have a good weekend. Take care. Be safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.